Hi everybody, this is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of the house system and kind of catch up on some of the reviews that I haven't really done yet. So this is the rack for the main house. You can see it still needs a little bit of cleanup. We're kind of working on some of that. But for the most part, all the equipment is in, everything's kind of here. And I wanted to kind of go through how we handled this in the house. So as you can see, this is a full-size rack. They don't get a lot bigger than this. It's an open rack, which is better for ventilation, but I've got this closet here that can enclose everything in. You can hear the exhaust fan in there. When the closet is closed, you don't really hear that exhaust fan. It doesn't run constantly. It's running right now just because it had gotten warm in there. So in this rack, what we have is the, I'll just kind of go through it. The top here is all the network gear. One of the Control4 controllers is below that. So I've got two switches up here. One is a PoE switch and one of them is just a standard non-PoE switch. And the reason why it's two instead of one big one is I didn't want fans. So I got the biggest fanless versions of these that I could get. And these are from Arachnus, which is one of the better quality companies specifically for custom installation. Their gear is actually very well made. It works very well. It's extremely reliable. You can monitor it with Oversee. And then one of the big advantages for custom AV systems is that everything has been designed optimally for the kind of rack setups that we do in homes rather than in commercial settings. So you'll see all the ports are on the back, which is not true of a lot of switches. Routers up here at the package router. There's a bunch of hidden gear here. This is where a lot of the HDMI baluns are that go out to all the TVs in the house. Here's where a lot of my sources are. Below that is another set of sources and junk. The junk will get taken away once this is all cleaned up and done, but there's a Apple TV here, we've got a Roku, Amazon Fire Stick. Basically one of the approaches I decided to take on this was just to sort of take I'll have everything I could possibly want set up and ready to go, and then I can use whichever version of it I want. They're not all that expensive, so I figured why not. We've got a Sony UHD Blu-ray player here. It's the 800M. This is the first edition of it. I thought about upgrading, probably should upgrade, but what I'd actually rather do is replace it with one of the Panasonics, so I decided just to kind of install this for now. This is a 6-zone, 12-channel episode amplifier. It's roughly 50 watts a channel. I think 75, 80 watts a channel, 4 ohms. That's an RMS rating. It's got about 100 dB signal-to-noise ratio. This is not what I would call an audiophile amp, but this is certainly a decent amp. And this is actually being used currently for two purposes, and it's probably temporary. I'd like to change out the amplifiers to get a matching Trinnov Amplitude 16 or something like that. I originally had this kind of dream that was, you know, some things I get a good deal on, some things I don't. Amps are a little tricky. So I had this idea of doing all Purify for every channel, and it was just very expensive regardless of how you look at it. So I ended up deciding to do what I had, which I'll go through the rest of them in a moment, but I've used 6 of the channels for my overhead speakers, and I've used 6 of the channels for my multi-zone. This has RCA pre-outs on it, so I can actually add another amplifier to it. I can't have extra zones from that, but I don't need that in my case. In many cases, I have zones with multiple speakers, but it's just one zone. So for now, this is adequate. I had actually originally, you guys may know this from some earlier reviews, so I had used a much smaller, lower powered amplifier to do my multi-zone. And it was only like, I thought it was like 25 watts a channel. It turned out that it was really only about 15 watts a channel. And that turned out to be adequate for background music, but totally inadequate for me. So I don't want to bag on that product like it's so bad. There's nothing wrong with the product. It was actually a very good product. I needed like a souped up version that produced basically 4 or 5 times the power. So I got that with this episode. This thing integrates perfectly with the Control4 system. As I said, the amplifier quality is decent. This is the DSP version, so I've actually gone ahead and measured all my speakers and applied DSP to improve their performance. Very effective. Below that is one of the Definitive Technology Sub-Amp 600s that I have. So this particular one I bought, and I have another one that they gave me as part of a review system. And this one that's right here is being used for outdoor subwoofers. And it was just, I needed a sub-amp. I looked at different options, and this happened to be cheaper than some of the other options I had. There's nothing particularly special or great about it. It's like 200 watts a channel when you use it in 2-channel mode, 225, something like that maybe. It has some built-in EQ that was designed for the ported subwoofer, basically. It's an in-wall subwoofer that has a what's it called? Passive radiator. There we go. Passive radiator and a 13-inch driver. So they've done EQing around that, but I measured it and it actually works relatively well for the outdoor subs. I may change that out at some point, but I got a good price on it. Below here is a Pioneer. It's a VSX LX305. This is the lower end version of the Dirac receivers that they came out with recently. And you can see it's even still got all the stickers on it. 225 watts total, HDMI with HDCP. What are we at? 2.3. I should know that by now. 9.2 channels. It's got a lot of streaming capabilities. Supports high-res audio, you know, whatever that means, because the device itself, I think many of you know from some other reviews, is not the most high-resolution device, but for my purposes, it was perfect. It's extremely easy to use. It's been totally reliable for my use case. And the app, actually, I like the app that comes with it better than some of the others I've used, so it's got a decent app. It has Dirac. Dirac works well. It's just the standard basic Dirac, but it comes with a full bandwidth version, and I'm using it with Definitive Technology speakers, which we'll go down to in a little bit later in the video here. And the Definitive Technology speakers are fine for what they are, but like all in-wall speakers, especially all budget in-wall speakers, and these are definitely on the lower price range, a little bit of help from some EQ is great. And then of course Dirac does a great job in the bass. Even the standard version can do a lot as long as you get the basics with the subwoofers right. So I've really enjoyed having that. That's been good. It also turned out, so one of the things I've never liked about Odyssey, and it actually can be an issue with others, including the Trinnov processor, is that the microphone plugs into the processor or the receiver. And so you have to be local to the processor or have a really long cable. So when I first set up Dirac, I actually was having issues with the IP connection. And so what I did was I used the coaxial cable that runs from this closet downstairs, and I converted it over to 3.5 millimeter connections. I then used that to extend the microphone cable. It worked. It actually worked fine within the quality of that mic. I eventually got the IP issues straightened out. It had nothing to do with the receiver or with Dirac. It had to do with the way my network was set up, and it just took me a little while to figure out the right settings to solve that. So I did that originally, and then the nice thing about Dirac, though, is you don't have to do that. The other option is that you can actually log in. You can just find it on your network, basically. The microphone plugs into the computer. You don't have to be local to the receiver, and you can do your corrections. I like that concept so much that I wish that it was added to other products that are multi-zone. Because in general, outdoor or overhead or whatever can't really easily be corrected when you have to be able to connect a microphone directly to the source. But when you can do this indirect approach through IP like they did, you can basically calibrate anything. So a Dirac-based multi-zone system would be, I think, very cool. All right, so that's the Pioneer. This thing powers the downstairs system. I would say the biggest negative with this, and honestly, that's just meant for casually watching TV. Yes, it's an Atmos system. It's a 5.1.2 system, but it really wasn't intended to be like a full-on movie system with reference levels or any of that. But though overall, the system doesn't play that loud, and I think a lot of it is actually the receiver being a little underpowered for me. I listen loud, and I like movies played back at near reference or reference levels. So when I have turned up the system downstairs, I've noticed that it seemed like it wasn't quite there. You know, it didn't have everything it needed to get the job done. Having said that, as I said, I really think most people would be more than happy with it. This would be more than adequate. But I do intend to change out the amplifier at some point. In fact, I have a couple things happening. One is I have the new top-of-the-line Sony receiver in. It's much, much more powerful than this. It actually puts out about double the power. And so I'm going to change that in, and that will actually tell me quite a bit about whether power was an issue, but I also have some amplifiers I could use. I just have kind of run out of rack space where I have room to do that. Below that is the Trinnov Altitude 16. This is the newest version with the new DAC board. I believe it's a ESS Sabre dual differential DAC setup that they're using for this. Supposedly that improved the signal-to-noise ratio. THD plus noise, or SYNAD, has actually improved. THD by noise going down, the reciprocal of that being the SYNAD goes up. And so the performance of this is supposed to be at least as good or better than the old one. It was actually changed out largely because of part shortages and the fact that things like AKM DACs are impossible to get anymore. So this thing is a 20-channel processor. It's called a 16. It has 16 outputs, but it actually has 2 SPDIF outputs that you can add to it, each one being, of course, 2-channel, and that gives you the extra 4 channels. I'm not using all that. What I'm doing with this is it's of course running the home theater. So this is a 7.1.4 system theater. Some of you might be saying, like, why didn't you do wides? Why didn't you do 6 overheads, etc.? There isn't really a good reason other than cost complexity issues. I didn't get everything, again, for free. I had to pay for this, and I've done videos many times before, and I followed my own advice on this, where I've said, I think that you should not compromise speaker quality for speaker quantity, because the increase in quantity isn't going to overcome the decrease in quality. So in this case, I'm using all Perlisten S-series speakers. They are the best speakers that Perlisten makes. I'm using the S7Is for the fronts, and I'm using S4Is for the surrounds. And those, it was pretty expensive. And then there were some practical issues. So if I was to put wides in, this is actually roughly where one of the wides would go, and then it would kind of mirror that on the other side there. And they would have to aim towards the listening position. So I would have had to have built in some sort of a system here where I could aim some in-walls towards there. So what I have done is I've run wire. There is wires in the wall here that allow me to do wides. But I've had various thoughts about how I want to do that, including I may actually just do some tower speakers that I could run for stereo and then use them as wide. So they would sit kind of here, aim towards the listeners during that kind of listening. You would pull them back, maybe put them on wheels to do that, make it easy for typical stereo listening, something like that. And the really cool thing about these Trinnovs is that they have, I believe it's an infinite number. If it's not infinite, it's a very high number of presets that you can have. So you could do like stereo preset using the S7Is, stereo preset using the S7Ts, surround preset using the S7I, surround preset using the S7Ts instead. Excuse me. You could do a 9-channel preset. You could do a 7-channel preset. You could do a 5-channel preset. You could do EQ curve 1, EQ curve 2, EQ curve 3, and so on and so forth. And so you can just do whatever you want in that regard. Every other product I've ever used is typically limited to about 3 presets at most, and so you just can't get that level of flexibility. I can't afford to do this, but conceivably you could do something like a 32-channel processor. You could put the speakers in here for every surround format that exists, and then you could do presets that only uses the speakers necessary for that surround preset. And so that's one of the neat things about that processor. All right, so that's the Trinnov. Below that is an Outlaw audio. This is a 5-channel, I'm going to forget the proper name for this one, I apologize, but it's like 160 watts per channel. It's their lower end unit. I have to say, if you've never seen one of these in person, this thing, I think you'd be shocked at how good it is for the money. Power-wise, it seems like it's only kind of equal to a receiver, but it's not really. This thing will do full power times all 5 channels cleanly at that 150, 160 watt rating. Like it does, I bench tested this thing, I believe others have as well. This is the improved version that they came out with that has a better signal to noise ratio compared to the one that Gene De La Sala had reviewed. And so the advantage of this thing is that if you're using it to upgrade a receiver, it really is a serious and solid upgrade for most receivers. It probably wouldn't be a major upgrade for like a top-of-the-line Denon Marantz or even that new Sony I mentioned, just because they're about the same for power, and they're probably about the same for noise and distortion. Maybe a little worse, this is maybe a little bit better, but we're small upgrade. But for like anything under $1,500, let's say, probably even under $2,000, this is going to be a pretty solid upgrade. Now I'm using this to power all the surround speakers. Below that is another Definitive Technology sub-amp. This is the one that powers the 2 subwoofers downstairs. The spacing, by the way, and arrangement of this is semi-intentional. And by semi-intentional, what I mean was that anything that we needed to physically touch was kind of put here at what I would call like waist level. You know, arguably you might say you want to put it up here. What we did though is we put the sources up higher. The episode was stuck here actually due to wire issues. This ideally would have been somewhere else, but this thing, when we ran all the wires, we had a huge bundle, and then when they pulled them into the rack, what we realized was that if we then have to run them all the way down to the bottom of the rack, which is where I would have wanted to put this thing, we were kind of running into length issues. So we stuck it up higher so we didn't have that. Anyway, back to this. So that powers the other system, but then below that is a Purify amplifier. and that powers the LCRs, and then below that are the subwoofer amplifiers, and there's one Behringer, I'm going to forget now, I think it's the 6000 DSP one, which puts out, in theory, like 3,000 watts a channel. In practice, it's more like 1,500 to 2,000. And that one is not being used at the moment, but it's going to power a subwoofer up in the front corner that hasn't been installed yet. That's an 18-inch ported subwoofer that I did with a QB3 alignment. And then below that is the RBH subwoofer amplifier that powers the two dual 12 subwoofers in the back. And that thing does about, conservatively, I'd say 2,000 watts a channel, less conservatively about 2,400 watts a channel. The 2400 would be, it can do that one channel driven. Two channels driven, you're taxing the power supply and the outlet for that matter, and so it doesn't really do that well. But not the point. That is an insane amount of power, as you know, for a room that is not really that big. I've been saying the room's like 20 by 16, and then I said I've revised it. So it's 18 feet 7 inches long, 15 feet 8 inches wide, and 9 feet 8 inches tall. That's after all the walls were kind of finished and everything. It was, in theory, a 20 by 16 room, but it's a sound isolated room, so we lost some space because of that. So that's the rack, and this is the brains of the house. And so basically we've centralized everything. So let me tell you the good and the bad quickly about that. The good of centralizing everything is that I don't have equipment anywhere. Like once this door is closed, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and do that. You can see the fan noise is gone now. The equipment is all locked away. There's nothing you can see anymore, and it's out of sight, out of mind. The control floor system is programmed basically to handle all the controlling of everything, so we don't have to deal with all of that. I don't have to have an equipment rack or a shelf or anything downstairs to handle all that equipment. And so I get a very minimalist, clean look, and I've done some other videos showing the house, but basically the house is very clean and minimalist, and so it goes well with that approach we were trying to do. Okay, great. Negative. Well, if you like to tinker, it's really hard to pull gear out of this rack and replace it with new gear. So if you want to try a different amp, you want to try a different receiver, you want to do whatever, that's not as simple as just unplugging one and plugging in the other. For amplifiers, everything, all the cables are very neatly tied down in the back to make sure that everything's clean and reliable. If I pull out an amp and put in a new one, if the connectors are in a different place, I may not have the wire length I need to be able to do that. I have to unclip potentially a dozen plus zip ties, hope that I have enough connection length to actually handle the new placement of the binding posts, and then re-tie it down, which I suck at. I actually had a professional do it. For receivers, it's even trickier because it's connected to the control floor system. This is far too far away to be able to control it through any other means. And so to be able to make it so you've got a control floor acting as like a universal remote, somebody has to come in, remove the old, let's say the Pioneer, and put in the new. As I mentioned, I'm probably going to be throwing the Sony in to try that next. So if you are somebody who likes to change out gear, I would say, think about whether you want to remote locate it like this or not. This is a tricky way to do it, but for the most part, I think this is a better way to do it, and I'm really happy that we did this. As I said, much cleaner look. So we're going to go downstairs now and check out the rest of the system.